As Ed and I were preparing today for the Banned Book Week service, I have to admit that we've had many discussions about it because it's not just a simple declaration, but there are positives and negatives to the notion of what do we mean by banned books. And that will probably come through a little bit as we go through the service today. But the celebration of banned books is really hardly a joyous celebration. Rather, it recognizes the growing problem of banned books in the United States as well as other countries. The American Library Association reports that there have been a record number of attempts to ban books in 2022, up 38% from the previous year. Of those challenges, the organization notes, the vast majority were written by or about members of the LGBTQIA community and people of color. These increasing efforts to limit access to books limit what we can be taught. Just in the last few weeks, there have been numerous examples of efforts to limit what books teachers can teach or what books are able to be in libraries. As reported in the Washington Post, one teacher in South Carolina was taken to task for teaching the book Between the World and Me, a National Book Award book authored by Ta-Nehisi Coates. This book was reported to go against the South Carolina proviso that forbids teachers from making students feel guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress. Restricting access is yet another attempt to ignore the messy nature of our country's past and heritage. As author Ta-Nehisi Coates points out in our UU Soul Matters guide for this month, here is what I want you to know. In America, it is traditional to destroy the Black body. It is heritage. Banning books that discuss our messy heritage of our race relationships or diversity of our people, whether it be in our family structure, sexual identity, or preference, is a de facto destruction, making these invisible. Thus denying the inherent worth of every person, our first principle, and further denying justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, our second principle. The extent of book banning is ever increasing. It extends from children's literature, including Dr. Seuss' Hop and Pop, the Lorax, books such as The Giver, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Where the Wild Things Are, and the Harry Potter series. You may remember that last year we watched during our Story for All Ages and Tango Makes Three about two male penguins that adopted an orphan penguin. This lovely tale was also banned, as was mentioned today by LeVar Burton. The current backlash against some books and ideas isn't the first time this has happened in American history. Some of the earliest attempts to censor and block books goes back to early America, and actually it goes back even much further in our ancient history. But when Thomas Morton's book, Critical of the Puritans, was banned by the Puritans, Uncle Tom's Cabin, published by the Unitarian Harriet Beecher Stowe in 1858, was probably one of the most famous works to be banned, as it offered an unabashed depiction of slavery as evil, brutal institution, which was not well received by the Southern slave owners. When the Comstock Act was passed in 1873, it was titled An Act for the Suppression of the Trade in and Circulation of Obscene Literature and Articles of Immoral Use. This broad act did not define obscene, but rapidly applied it to a wide range of material about such topics as birth control, abortion, and sexuality. Works of artistic merit were banned along with the writing of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales and the works of authors William Faulkner, Hemingway, Steinbeck, and Margaret Sanger. The ripples from this law continued long after it ended in 1865. And on a personal note, I remember my mother taking away a newly purchased book by me in 1868, Lady Chatterley's Lover. And also the shock when I produced a copy of Our Bodies, Ourself in 1974. So early in the 20th century, the term banned in Boston gained notoriety as booksellers colluded to avoid selling books they perceived that might lead to vice or deviance. The result of the banning of books such as Voltaire's Candide and Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. After World War II, there was a large effort to ban comic books. As psychiatrist Frederick Wortham thought they promoted delinquency. And I can still remember the struggle that I had with my father to allow us to buy books, but they were pretty homogenized by the 1960s and 1990s. And there was an effort overnight to bring comics down to a level appropriate only for the youngest or the dimmest of readers. So that doesn't say much for me, does it? But anyway, that was a big deal when we could get a quarter to get a comic book. And the comic book legal defense funds, as it says in its history, what a damper that put on a variety of books. Of course, recently we've seen the resurgence of graphic novels, for example, which have also been largely banned in many libraries. More recently, there's been an ever-enlarging list of books banned by schools, library, and bookstores. Wonderful, important books such as Mouse. And if you have never read Mouse, I certainly recommend it. It is a graphic novel about talking about what happened during World War II in terms of the Nazi persecution of Jews. Wonderful, important books included also The Bluest Eye, The Absolute Diary of a Part-Time Indian, and Gender Quest, a biography. We have a long history of book banning and censorship, but we pay a price. This year's ban book has the theme, Let Freedom Read. And as we consider the importance of freedom read, reflect on these important democratic tenets. 1, the freedom of conscience, including the right to express individual views in any format. And 2, the unrestricted public access to library materials of all kinds. But it is just as important to consider how can we as UUs, given the tenets of our faith and our covenant, address the growing trends on censorship and book banning. Thank you. All right. You got it?
I do. It's right there.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, dear. We can tell how well coordinated we are.
Semi-coordinated.
Semi-coordinated we are.
So, Karen has laid out a history of book banning as well as an argument that we, as members of a progressive religious congregation, might all comfortably get behind. What sort of person could find offense in the image of 2 male penguins adopting a penguin chick? What monster finds Maurice Sendak to be offensive? Who would deny the Lorax? But let me offend you and remind you of a phrase that comes from a 19th century muckraking journalist, a classic saying, comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. It falls to me, former librarian that I am, to raise the issue of what we do with those books, that music, those art forms that seem beyond all reasonable doubt to be offensive. Louis Brandeis famously noted that the First Amendment of our Bill of Rights does not give you license to cry fire in a crowded theater. Beyond crying fire, what limits are there? Are we simply talking government censorship? What responsibility do we, as seekers of truth, whatever, as Pontius Pilate wondered, whatever truth is, and wherever truth may lead us. And whose truth are we talking about? The year before I was born, 1951, the French philosopher Simone de Beauvoir published an essay entitled, "Must We Burn de Sade?" I won't ask how many of us might have any of the Marquis's works on their bookshelves. I will allow that in years gone by, I have had a number of his books. I will also allow that they were offensive in the extreme, difficult to read, not only for their content, but also, frankly, because they were so poorly written. Should they be burned? De Beauvoir thought not. Despite her critique of their style and her distaste for their subject matter, I will say that I did not buy them for the shelves of the Danville Public Library when I was director. There are guidelines that a collection manager follows, as well as budget constraints. Though de Sade did not need to meet those, though de Sade did not meet those, not because of his offensiveness, but simply because his fiction was, as we librarians like to say, out of scope. Perhaps a writer of Mennonite sadomasochism would have been included, though so far none to my knowledge have come forward. And this points to the hard questions around banned books. What do we as progressives do with material that we find questionable? My favorite Italian quantum physicist, Carlo Rovelli, includes in his latest collection of essays a firm endorsement of an Italian publisher who had put out a new translation of Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf. Rovelli praised its publication as an act of courage, and then proceeded to write about what he had learned from reading Hitler's screed. Rovelli said that he was overwhelmed by the sense of fear that dripped from each line of Hitler's memoir. He had not, to that moment, thought of fascists as driven by fear. But reading Hitler's words, he came to realize that fascism gained what power it has from the fear that underlies it. An important lesson for all of us, and one we might miss. Bell Hooks has been taken to task for reading right-wing evangelical literature and responded to her critics by asking who wouldn't want to know what those people were thinking. Should we burn Hitler's books? As a librarian, I had no control over whose hands such books might fall. A young person seeking justification for his or her white supremacist rage. Another young person wondering why his or her fellow citizens were so consumed by their anger and seeking a way to understand it. Sun Tzu, in his Art of War, tells us of the importance of understanding our enemies. He might have gone on to encourage us to understand not just them, but our friends, our neighbors, our fellow countrymen as well. And let's be clear, no one can censor short of a governmental body. Karen has named a number of such bodies: school boards, city, state, and federal governments. It has only been within my lifetime that what was arguably, and I know that I may find some dissent here, but what is arguably, in my mind, the greatest novel in English literature, James Joyce's Ulysses. It's only within my lifetime has it been allowed to be imported into the United States, despite having been accused of obscenity. Saying a work was banned in Boston was a commonplace, and that bastion of Irish culture had sought to ban that masterpiece of Irish literature. Unless we think back on this smugly, consider that the Watch and Ward Society of Boston, which was responsible for that banning, was largely made up of a sterner, more intolerant breed of Unitarians, but of Unitarians nonetheless. But what of other restrictions? Not governmental, but restrictions we place upon works of literature through our own actions. My own daughter will not read any of the works of Vladimir Nabokov, a man I consider to be not simply one of the masters of English prose, but ironically, considering that English was his second or third or fourth language, but a writer whose mastery of the novel's form was second to none. Jenny points to Lolita as having pedophilia at its core, and further notes that Nabokov had returned to that theme a number of times and in a number of works. Must we burn Nabokov? Must we refuse to buy Nabokov? And not simply novels. Wagner was a notorious anti-Semite. Does that infect his music? Does Richard Strauss's having been named Reich Minister of Culture in 1933 by the Nazi regime come forth unbidden in his music? Martin Heidegger's writings, a crucial line of thought in 20th century philosophy, arguably has a strong streak of fascism within it. And Heidegger was notoriously allied with Nazism. He wore a uniform when he taught classes. My own Zen heritage goes back to Hakuin Yatsutani Roshi, a man who stood by the autocratic and genocidal regime in wartime Japan, and who, despite the lack of a Jewish presence in wartime Japan, continued to espouse anti-Semitic views. This was always a complete puzzle to me. And yet his Zen teachings are revered by me and my fellow practitioners. How can we tease apart the good from the bad within them? Must we burn Wagner? Must we burn Heidegger? Must we burn Yatsutani? Consider how much we gain from the four last songs of that arguably Nazi sympathizer, Richard Strauss, of the examination of existence by that Martin Heidegger, certainly a Nazi sympathizer. How much do we learn of the nature of desire and of its expression by Nabokov? How much do we learn of humor and of pathos from the films of the disgraced Woody Allen? How much do we throw out? How much do we save from Thomas Jefferson, from David Hume, from Aristotle? All men who espoused in words and deeds unvarnished racism, and yet all thinkers we cherish. Our own heritage as Unitarian Universalists contains within it, in its New England manifestations, ministers who own slaves, right there, right across from Harvard Yard. Must we burn the 7 principles? All things to ponder in this banned book week. All things to consider as the current election cycle looms. All things to consider as we reach into that bookshelf by our couch, as we frequent our local bookstore, as we place an order for our next book on Kindle. No one said life would be easy, not even the Lorax.